So on our last lesson, we talked about growth of plants. Today we're going to focus in on some of the plant organs, the leaves, the stems, and the roots. With that, we're going to be talking about some of the uses of the leaves, stems, and roots, some of the specializations, so how have some plants adapted to be specialized for their environment or their function. And we're also going to be talking about the structure of the leaves, stems, and roots, and how that structure relates to the function. We have a few goals. The first is to be able to explain the structures of the stems, leaves, and roots. So what tissues are part of these different organs, and how do these tissues allow these organs to perform the functions that they need to do? You also need to be able to describe how vascular bundles differ in monocots versus dicots in, stems and roots. And remember, those vascular bundles are, vasculature is comparable to the circulatory system of humans. So these vascular tissues are going to be carrying water and nutrients. And then I also want you to be able to list some of the uses of stems, leaves, and roots, because plants are important to humans. And the uses of stems, leaves, and roots are one of the ways that they are important to humans. Now, coming into this unit, you will know a lot about plants already. They're everywhere. You have probably talked about them every year in school. And so what I want you to do is pause the video and consider the following questions. Just in point form, jot down some of the things you already know about plants and sort of their uses to humans. Now, while we won't be answering these exact questions, we are going to be talking about some of the uses. So I wanted to get you thinking about plants before we get there. Now, before we can talk about the structure or the uses of leaves, stems, and roots, you have to know the function. So each of these different components of the plant have a very specific function. And as you may know, the structure of an organ is closely related to its function. In the case of leaves, we have three functions. Primarily, it is the site of photosynthesis. So that's where it is going to be absorbing the energy from the sun, taking in carbon dioxide, and releasing oxygen. So as a result of this function of photosynthesis, it also needs to be able to allow for gas exchange, which means there needs to be some sort of hole in order to let gases come in and out. Leaves can also act as protection. Now, not all leaves will be acting as protection, but ones that maybe produce toxins or gross tasting substances, as well as specialized leaves, which we'll get into later, can help protect the plant. The primary function of stems is transport. So they bring things from the roots to the leaves, and from the leaves to the roots, depending on what is needed where. The stems are also really important for structure. So they are what are going to be keeping the leaves and the reproductive organs, standing upright and available. Finally, roots, which we talked about in our last lesson. The roots are really important for anchoring the plant in place, so it keeps it from falling over, moving, whatever. Roots also absorb water and nutrients, and they will store things like water and carbohydrates. So as we carry on our discussion of structure of these different organs, keep in mind their function, because structure is related to function. Now, I mentioned earlier that the function of leaves was to perform photosynthesis, gas exchange, and protection. Well, some leaves are really specialized for protection. As you can see here, we have a cactus. So cactuses will produce spines to help protect them from being eaten. Similarly, the tobacco plant produces the chemical nicotine, which tastes gross, and again, protecting that tobacco plant from being eaten. Another way that leaves can be specialized for protection is to protect the tree or the plant from the cold. Now, as you may know, leaves fall during autumn, and so this is a particular specialization of leaves in order to help conserve water. And so in areas that experience below freezing temperatures like Canada, you will see trees in the fall, their leaves will change color and they will fall off the tree in order to help preserve water and nutrients in the tree. One final specialization of leaves is that of storage. And so over here you can see the leaves of an aloe, and this looks like a jade plant, and even onions. And so all of these are specialized leaves that are storing water and or carbohydrates. And you can tell when a leaf is specialized for storage because usually it'll be thick and plump and often have this waxy cuticle. And so you see over here these jade plants are very waxy and shiny, and that helps to keep the water stored in those leaves. And so that's an example of how its structure relates to its function. It has this waxy cuticle to prevent water loss when its primary function is storage of water or carbohydrates. Stems can also be specialized. One way that stems can be specialized is through for the purpose of storing food. And so some examples of that is actually the potato. So potatoes are a tuber, and it stores starches and water. Another example is corms of gladioli or rhizomes of irises or ginger. And so in this next image, you can actually see those. So we have our rhizomes, we have our potato tumors, we have our corms, and once again, you have these big fat structures, and they're actually part of the stem, and they are specialized to store water or carbohydrates, whereas usually the stem's function is for transport or structural support. There are two other ways that stems can be specialized, which include stolons, which are basically stems that grow along the soil instead of upright. So spider plants will do this, and also vines, and they're kind of similar, but in this case, the stems are going to be taking advantage of those other objects. Do you remember which type of tropism is commonly found in vines? That's from our last lesson. In case you're wondering, it was thigmotropism, a directional change in response to touch. So anyhow, those are two other types of specialization of stems. Instead of growing upright, they either grow along the soil or sort of around other structures. And so you can see that here in this lovely vined up window, or here in our spider plant. So we talked about specialization of leaves in the form of protection and storage, the specialization of stems basically for protection, but also ones that can grow along the soil or on other substances. And here we have specialization of roots. So roots can act as additional support. So not only do we have the stem acting as support, but sometimes roots can also act as support. And so an example of that is the prop roots of corn. And so you think of it as like they help prop up the corn. I'll show you a picture of it in a moment. The other way that roots are specialized, of course, is storage. So not only do they help with the anchoring of the plant and absorbing, but they also act as storage. So they'll hold water as well as carbohydrates. And so an example of roots that contain carbohydrates are carrots or beets, so those are actually the roots of the plants. And finally, once again, protection. So roots can also produce toxic chemicals or acids to prevent animals from eating them. So by protecting the roots, it protects the plant. If you take a look at these pictures, what you can see are a few roots that are specialized in storage. So we have our happy little carrots up here, or our happy little beets over here. And these are examples of tap roots, which means sort of that main root. And then over here we have tuberous roots, so our yam and our sweet potato also will be holding carbohydrates. And down here we have prop roots. And so these are roots that extend over the soil and just help to maintain that structure and support of tall plants. So this is a picture of sugarcane, but it also exists in corn plants. Earlier, you answered a few questions regarding the importance of leaves, stems, and roots. And one of the importances is related to the uses that they have. So, of course, food. Leaves, stems, and roots can all be used for food. They can be used for medicine, they can be used for fuel, tons of different uses. Even religious ceremonies. Erosion control is a really important purpose of roots in ecosystems, and so the uses are immense. For your plants STSE, you're going to be exploring a possible use and importance to society. By no means does it have to be one of these, but it could be if you wanted it to be. So now that we've talked about some of the functions of leaves, stems, and roots, we're going to get into the structure. The first structure we need to talk about is the leaf. Now, if you recall, the primary function of the leaf is photosynthesis. Now, let's take a look at the chemical reaction of photosynthesis. So we require carbon and water, and we are going to be putting out glucose and oxygen. Now, this is a chemical reaction occurring in the leaves of plants that is imperative for the life of plants because, of course, plants need that glucose to survive. They're autotrophs. They're creating their own energy source. And so what that means is plants need to be able to capture light. So they need that solar energy, which means they need to be exposed to light. They also need to be able to get water. So whether that's from the environment or from the root system, they need to be getting their water from somewhere. They also need to exchange gases. This carbon dioxide is coming from the atmosphere, and that means they need to take it in, and they also need to be releasing oxygen. And finally, if they're creating glucose, glucose doesn't just get stored in the leaves. It usually gets stored in roots or stems sometimes. And so there needs to be a transport system that will move that glucose elsewhere. Finally, because it's being exposed to so much light, you somehow need to be able to minimize water loss. If plants are sitting out in the sun all day, then the sun is hot and that causes water to evaporate, which means they need to somehow minimize evaporation of water. And the plant leaf does all of these things so beautifully in its structure. Okay, let's take a look at this cross section of a leaf. So what that means is I took a leaf and I cut it. And so at the top, you'll get up here. So that's the part of the plant you would see if you're looking down at a plant. The part of the leaf. And then down here is the bottom, and that would be the underside of the leaf. And then I cut it in half, like I'm looking at the cross section of a pie or something. What I have done is highlighted a few key words, such as palisade mesophyll, spongy mesophyll, stoma, guard cell, and just generally mesophyll. And I just highlighted this now, the waxy cuticle. So the mesophyll, as a function, I want you to notice that it's green. So that's this space right here. It is green. Why are plants green? Pause the video. Can you figure it out? Why are plants green? Hopefully, you said photosynthesis. Hopefully, you mentioned the pigment chlorophyll. So plants are green because they contain a pigment called chlorophyll, and this pigment is what is responsible for capturing that sunlight energy and using it to have the chemical reaction of photosynthesis. And the mesophyll is the photosynthetic layer of the leaf. So that's where most of the photosynthesis is going to be happening. And there's two different types of mesophyll. We have palisade and we have spongy. If you take a look, just try and notice what's the difference between these cells up here and these down here. Pause the video, try and notice. What can you just tell by looking at it? Hopefully you paused it and gave it a minute of thought. You may have noticed a few things. One, this spongy mesophyll are more circular, I guess, whereas the palisade are more oval shaped. They're longer. They're elongated. The other thing you might have noticed is that the palisade mesophyll are arranged neatly. So they're arranged in these sort of columns, whereas the spongy mesophyll is loosely packed and with larger spaces of air in between them. So this is where photosynthesis is going to be occurring. We also have our waxy cuticle. Now this waxy cuticle is on the top of the plant, and what that does is help prevent moisture from escaping out this way. So it stops it from escaping out that way. Now the stoma down here is a really important structure of the plant. A stoma is basically an opening, and it's through this opening in which gases exchange. So we will have carbon dioxide coming in, and we will have oxygen coming out. Now, the downside of this opening is that water can also escape out this opening. So H2O can also escape. And what we have are little guard cells. We have little guard cells on either side of the opening of the stoma. And these guard cells will regulate when the stoma is open versus closed. And that helps to limit the amount of water loss. So this is the general structure of a plant leaf, and there's a few things that I want to point out to you. So if up here is the top, then it makes a lot of sense that this palisade mesophyll, which is actually where most of the photosynthesis is going to be occurring, is at the top, because that means that it is in the closest contact with sunlight, because sunlight is going to be coming in from up here. And we want to make these leaves as efficient as possible. If the photosynthetic components were further down, then the light would have farther to reach, or there would be things blocking it, whatever. And so it makes sense that this photosynthetic tissue is closest to the top of the leaf, because the top of the leaf is going to be what is, well, facing upwards toward the sun. And because it's facing upwards towards the sun, it's a good thing that it has this waxy cuticle on top. And you can actually see this in plants. This waxy cuticle is a little bit shiny, and so the top of the leaf is often shiny, and the bottom of it is often dull because there is not as much of a waxy cuticle. There's a little, but not as much. And there's also these sort of gaps that exist in order to allow gas exchange. Now, one thing that was missing from that previous diagram was vascular bundles. Okay, so here are our vascular bundles right here. I'm drawing them, shading them in black a little bit. And these, of course, are going to be carrying water. So our H2O, and our glucose. And our vascular bundles are going to be interspersed with our spongy mesophyll. So our spongy are loosely packed, and that is how water is able to access the mesophyll, and how glucose leaves our mesophyll and is stored in other places of the plant, whether it's the stem or the roots. And it's really important that these structures are in close proximity to one another so that, well, it has access, or these mesophyll have access to all the reactants that they need, whether it's water or carbon dioxide. And they also have a way to get rid of the products, which are glucose and oxygen. So we would have CO2 coming in from outside, going to these plants. And we also have water coming from, over here, going to these plants. And, not plants, these mesophyll cells. And then our product from this reaction is going to be, oxygen is going to be coming out, and glucose is going to be going into the vascular bundle. And so all the bits and pieces are going to go where they need to go. And everything is in close proximity to one another. Okay, so over there, what we just finished talking about was the structure of a leaf. And, those would be, one thing I forgot to mention was, if we take a look at this leaf, cross-section, it's important to know that this is actually the cross-section of a dicot. Monocot leaves will look a little bit different. For instance, they will have stomata on the top and bottom, and because their veins run parallel, you're going to have sort of vascular bundles that are regularly spaced throughout them. Okay, anyhow, back to stem structure. So that was leaves, and now we're going to talk about stems. There's two types of stems. The first is herbaceous, and the second is woody. So herbaceous stems actually photosynthesize. They're the ones that will appear visibly green. So some examples of herbaceous plants that you might be familiar with would be columbine, peonies, some types of poppies, chrysanthemums. And then we have woody plants. Unsurprisingly, woody plants are plants that have wood. So, maple tree, elm tree, pine tree, they have wood and bark. Now, a piece of terminology that's important to know that you probably have already run into, and we will talk about in a minute, is vascular bundle. So again, vasculature is just the transport system in a plant. And so it's going to be carrying things like water and sugars. A vascular bundle is just an arrangement of the vascular tissue. If you recall, two types of vascular tissue are xylem and phloem. In, I think, our next lesson, we're going to talk about specifically how this even works and the physics of it. But for now, we're just going to be looking at the arrangement of vascular bundles in the stem structure. So here is the cross-section of a stem of a herbaceous plant. So that means we took a stem and then we cut it in half, and we're looking at it sort of at the width of it. Now, I mentioned that it was important to know the difference between dicots and monocots. Just know that sometimes you're going to find the word eudicot instead of dicot, and they're sort of, for our purposes, we're going to say they're the same thing. What you can see here are vascular bundles. So over on our dicot, we have our vascular bundles arranged along sort of the outside of the stem. But if you compare it to a monocot, these vascular bundles are sort of scattered throughout the stem. In each of these bundles, we're going to have our xylem and our phloem. And in each of these bundles, we're also going to have our xylem and phloem. This image is showing the same thing, but it looks a little bit different because it's a microscopic image as opposed to a cartoon. But regardless, in the dicots, oops-a-daisy, moving the screen, in the dicots, we see our vascular bundles formed in this ring, and in our monocots, those bundles are scattered throughout the stem. Now, those were our herbaceous stems. Here we have our woody stems, and woody stems, in my opinion, are a little bit more complicated because they are the ones that are going to be getting that secondary growth and growing in terms of girth. They're going to be adding layers each year. So our woody stems have a few tissues that are important for you to know, and we have talked about them before. The first is our vascular cambium, and you can see that over here highlighted in red. If you recall, that vascular cambium is the meristematic cell layer. So that's where cell division is going to be occurring, resulting in our secondary xylem and phloem. That's the secondary growth that we talked about in our last lesson. And you can actually see that over here. We have our phloem on one side of the vascular cambium, and on the other we have our xylem on the other side of the vascular cambium. And that xylem is always going to be on the inside, and the phloem is always going to be on the outside. Bark is an important component of woody stems, and it's probably one that you're very familiar with. Cork is composed of phloem, cork cambium, and cork. This bark, so the phloem, cork cambium, and cork, together make bark, and bark helps to protect the what is effectively the stem, the woody stem of the plant. So if we have our vascular cambium, whose function is to produce phloem and xylem, then we also have our cork cambium, whose purpose is to create the cork layer. So one produces the cork and one produces the xylem and phloem, or the vascular tissues. Now, two other pieces of terminology that I think are really interesting are the heartwood and sapwood, and you may have heard of these before. Now, the heartwood is the central portion of the stem, and the heartwood is actually non-functional secondary xylem. What this means is it doesn't actually work. It doesn't do anything anymore. The heartwood is often a little bit heavier or more durable than the sapwood. And so the sapwood is functional xylem. So it has that secondary xylem that is going to be functional. That means we are going to get movement of substances up the plant. And so that sapwood xylem is doing what it's supposed to, whereas the heartwood is no longer functional. So it's not functional vascular tissue anymore. As we mentioned last lesson, we have tree rings that form as a result of this secondary growth. And so what you see if you take a cross-section of a woody stemmed plant is these growth rings, and you will get alternating bands of light and dark. And so xylem is actually able to grow larger in the spring. And so here, if you take a look at this cross-section, our xylem is right here, and the size of the cells are much larger than the summer growth, because typically there's a lot more water allowing the plant to grow large in the spring. Now, I keep talking about vascular tissue. Like any tissue, it's made up of cells. And so there's two types of cells. we have xylem and phloem. And there are two different types of xylem and phloem cells each. Just know that, like any other tissue, they are composed of cells. And so we have some over here, and they have slightly different shapes. So we've talked about the structure of leaves, we've talked about the structure of stems, and here we're going to talk about roots. So there's two different types of roots, and we have run into this terminology before. We have the tap root, which has one thick central root with smaller roots off of it. And we also have fibrous roots, so made up of lots of small fibrous branching roots. Both roots, or all roots, will have something called root hairs. And so these root hairs are little microscopic extensions, and that's where most of the water is going to be absorbed because, of course, these root hairs increase surface area, just like the villi that you have in your small intestine. You've seen this image in the previous lesson, and here you can actually see those root hairs. And what we talked about last time was the root cap, where it helps protect the growing root. And we have three layers: the cell production zone, which is where cells are actively dividing, the elongation zone, where cells are elongating, and the differentiation zone, which is where cells are going to be transforming into the different tissues. So they're becoming specialized cells. So just like the stems, roots will also have vascular tissue. And remember that vascular tissue comes in the form of xylem and phloem. Now, one of the learning goals for this lesson is knowing differences between dicots and monocots. And in this case, one of the differences is the way that those vascular bundles are arranged. And so when we are looking at a dicot, you will see that the xylem, one of those vascular tissues, are at the center of the root, and they're often going to be forming that X shape. Whereas if you look at a monocot, the xylem are these little balls, and they're going to be forming a sort of ring or circular pattern at the center of the root. So that is it for our stems, leaves, and roots. You may recall that at the beginning of this lesson, we talked about the functions of the leaves, stems, and roots. We also went through some examples of how the leaves, stems, and roots can specialize, whether it's for storage, protection, or support. We talked about how we talked about the structure of the leaves, stems, and roots, and linked that structure to the function. And finally, we talked about how the vascular bundles, so that xylem and phloem, will look a little bit different when we're talking about monocots versus dicots. And we talked about that in the case of herbaceous stems and also roots. So that's it for today. As always, please let me know if you have any questions, and good luck.